Mind, self, society.
Hello everyone, and welcome once again to SOC 236, Mind, Self, and Society. And today we're going to be looking at the concepts of the self and identity. And I would argue that these two concepts and the whole host of research agendas associated with them are perhaps the two most important things to focus on in the realm of sociological social psychology. Principally because if we are following along from last week and our look at the processes of socialization, what we see is that sociologists and sociological social psychologists, as opposed to general psychology, look and see the self and these concepts of identity as ones that are inherently socially structured. And so while things like genetics and biological characteristics may play a role, it is almost impossible to try to explain, perhaps maybe not the self, but to explain the concept and its subsequent outcomes of identity from a strictly biological perspective. Principally because identity is, in fact, a set of social relationships and social identifications. Now, before we get into any of the material from the chapter, I do want to address a few points. And first and foremost, I'm in the process, or actually, by the time you read this, I will be done grading the midterm exams, and I will be letting you guys know where you stand currently in the course. Apart from that, I actually don't think there's any course-related announcements. Oh, I totally forgot. While I was going through the various assignments that I'd anticipated us doing in this second portion of the course, it came to my attention that I believe I was giving you guys too much work. And I hope that you guys don't see that as a problem. And of course, if you think it's a problem and you would like more assignments, please let me know and I will be happy to oblige. But I was looking at the two assignments I wanted you guys to do. One was this reflection journal that tries to take what we have learned in through the various weeks and apply it to contemporary circumstances or your own upbringing or your interpretation of other people's behaviors, right? So the idea is to put into practice what we've learned, right? So again, much of what we've learned are theories or empirical evidence to support those theories. And so I'm curious to see how you would apply those theories to circumstances in your own life or perhaps larger or broader social currents or social events. Or just events. I guess all events are social to some degree or another. And the other assignment was supposed to be these set of section essays that were going to ask you to answer one out of a series of questions in long form and respond to it in a way that captures both the material and expresses your understanding of it while also taking the material, finding outside sources, and extending it beyond what we've looked at. Now, given that we are rapidly approaching the end of the course, and I know you guys are very devastated at that fact, I thought it best not to overburden you with work, rather than if I end up underburdening you with work, well then, I guess, lucky for you. And so what I decided to do was to dispense with the section essays for this semester and focus strictly upon the reflection journals. And so, as I said earlier, what I'll be asking you to do is take the information, take the ideas that we were exposed to for that week, and again, reflect upon them. Reflect upon how they may influence certain social circumstances, whether or not they're ones that you have lived through, ones that we are witnessing now, ones that you're aware of historically, or perhaps even thinking about your own upbringing, your own social development, your own concept of identity. And so these theories and these pieces of empirical research are valuable not only for helping us explain helping us to explain the individual within society and this interplay between the concepts of mind, self, and society, obviously the title of the course, but can also serve as a form of or a new way of understanding existing events. And so you are free to choose how you want to approach it, as long as it's within those particular confines of the material that we focused on and your application of that material. And so I hope it is not too difficult. I do want to remind you that it is necessary to cite whatever source, including from the textbook, in ASA format. Now, independent of all that, I do want to address some of the rapid changes that we've seen in our society over the past week and a half. I know that given the position of Lehman College and the City University of New York generally, many of our students were surprised to find out the results of this past presidential election, where we saw now President-elect Donald Trump beat out Hillary Clinton. And there has been a number of widespread concerns for different aspects of the college community, not only just issues of, say, college funding, but issues of immigration, issues of identity, of race, principally because, as we saw in this past election, much of the rhetoric being espoused by Donald Trump and his campaign was very divisive and very much focusing on the interests of white Americans to the extent of, or to the detriment perhaps of other Americans, and even more so the interests of white male Americans. Now I realize I fit into that category, but I don't believe that I would be, I don't believe he would support much of what I do, but that's besides the point. And I do want to stress that I am not trying to be political here. You all are welcome to make whatever political decisions you like, and I respect and support you in whatever you guys choose to do. But rather that there has been a deep seed of concern among the college community. With that in mind, I would like to read to you the address or the statement given by President Cruz of Lehman College, because I believe it's very important for you to hear if you have not heard it already. And if you have heard it already, or you have read it already, then you can either listen again or you can fast forward. It's one of the beauties of these online lectures, as it were. And while I'll never have the oratory prowess as President Cruz, I will do my best to present his message. Dear colleagues, as I reflect on the presidential election and its potential impact upon our college community, I feel the need to remind us of the immense responsibility we have at Lehman to carry forward our mission, to translate our values into action, and to do so with the sense of urgency and purpose that the times require. My call to action is simple and straightforward. First, let's educate ourselves about the conditions that drove the outcome of the election and the implications it has for our future. Second, let's engage in thoughtful discussion and civil debate about how best to understand and navigate the landscape we face, and to lead the way for others looking to expand opportunity, embrace diversity, and foster inclusion. Third, let's empower ourselves and redouble our efforts to eradicate the educational, health, and socioeconomic inequities that persist to this day in the Bronx, the city, and the region we serve. Doing so is the best way to live our college's value statement, a statement that calls upon us to provide the highest quality education in a caring and supportive environment where respect, integrity, inquiry, creativity, and diversity contribute to individual achievement and the transformation of lives and communities. Doing so with confidence is also the best way to build upon the legacy of our namesake, Herbert H. Lehman, who dedicated his life to better serving the underserved and to carry forward the long-established mission of Lehman College of the City University of New York. Although we do not yet know what the future will bring, our historic mission and the values we have not changed since Tuesday. There is much to reflect upon. To this end, I have asked the Provost Fain and Vice President Magdaleno to work with the faculty and staff on a series of formal and informal events, from talk circles to policy panels. We will kick things off with a town hall community conversation on Monday, November 14th from 3:30 to 5 p.m. at the Lovinger Theater. Now I realize that is today if you're listening to this on the day it was posted. Hopefully you are able to make it. If not, I have no doubt that there will be other similar opportunities. More information about these events will be forthcoming. In the meantime, as is the case nationally, there are many among our campus community that have expressed concerns about the election results. About what the election results mean for them and their loved ones. If you or someone you know is in this situation, please know that our counseling center is here to help. The center is located in room 114 of the old gym building. Telephone number 718-960-8761. I've also heard from some who are especially concerned about what they can do to safeguard themselves and their families from potential immigration actions. Through collaboration with CUNY Citizenship Now and the Jamie Lucero Mexican Studies Institute, our college provides immigration services in the Office of Community Engagement, located in room 302 of the old gym building. Telephone number 347-577-4020. CUNY Citizenship Now attorneys are ready and willing to help, including providing a free assessment of the immigration benefits for which students and their family members may already qualify. Several weeks ago, at convocation, I expressed my admiration for the college's commitment to reaching its full potential as an agent of change and as a steward of place. Today, I'm confident that we are well on our way. It is again time to roll up our sleeves, sharpen our focus, and open our hearts. Sincerely, Jose Luis Cruz, President, Lehman College, the City University of New York. And I do thank President Cruz for providing us with that statement, as I believe it helps to clarify once again the mission of the university and the mission of the college, and how we are here to seek out ways to eradicate these inequities that we see in our society, and to provide opportunities to anyone and everyone who seeks them. If you find that you are concerned about issues regarding race, gender, or immigration, I do strongly suggest that you seek out individuals within the college community for support. And these can be faculty, staff, other students. What matters is that everyone here is trying to help, and we will all do the best that we can. Now, it may be the case that we won't see any dramatic changes. It might be the case that we will. Regardless, we will do everything we can to ensure the safety of our students and the legacy of their education. And so, with that in mind, I actually do believe that this week's readings can speak to these issues that many of us have going through our heads in regards to the dramatic shifts that we saw in voting blocks in the general election, particularly as it relates to different identity groups and different status groups. Now that I've addressed that, I do want to get into a little bit of a discussion on these concepts of self and identity and how they are situated within the larger picture of sociological social psychology, and how in many ways they serve as the bridges between our concepts of mind, self, and society. Principally because when we think about a mind, right, what we are generally thinking about in the Gestalt sense, and when I say Gestalt, I mean in its total sense. Because most of us, nay, all of us, I would argue, unless you have a dramatic set of damage to your to different regions of the brain, perhaps it's the mesolimbic prefrontal cortex or MPFC or whatever. But all of us, to some degree or another, carry around with us a set of ideas or self-concepts as to who we are. And these self-concepts are in many ways, as I said, a Gestalt reflection of the complex interweaving of our brains and our environment. And so the mind, in and of itself, is this internal conscious and unconscious organ that we see, or perhaps don't see, but we see in action. And these are the things that contribute to and shape the self. And so when we get to this concept of the self, it serves as this bridge between the individual mind, as it were, and larger society as a whole. Because once you have a collection of selves, right, and they start to interact with one another, and they start to engage with one another, that's when you start to get the foundations of social relations. And so it is this section, as I said, that I believe to be the most important in the semester, although you could make a claim that many of the sections are important for the semester, and I hope that there aren't any particular sections that are not important for the semester, but that's besides the point. I'll stop rambling, and I will do my best to try to shorten this lecture. I realize they have been getting progressively longer as the semester goes on. Not because I want to torture you guys any more than I have to, but rather I find all this material very interesting, and so I get a little bit excited. So you have to excuse me. If we were in person in class, you guys could just tell me to shut up, and I would do so if it was necessary. But unfortunately, you are a captive audience because all I am looking at is a machine, and I am talking to it rather than directly to you, although I do my best to try. Now, in this chapter on self and identity, we are first introduced to a series of concepts that I want to be very clear about their meaning. And these concepts are presented, and to some degree or another, within the context of, and I believe the chapter starts out by talking about the issue of schizophrenia, right? This idea of having multiple unstable personalities and personality characteristics. And I believe that this example is one of the best to build off of, because on the one hand, most of us, right, when we think about the normative structure of the self or the normative structure of the brain, most of us do not have these sort of structural anomalies that contribute to changes in our behavior and inconsistencies in our actions. And so what we see when we think about someone who is suffering from schizophrenia is someone without the capacity to maintain a coherent sense of self over a long period of time. Or perhaps they contain multiple selves that overlap or interact or come up against one another. And so, because we know such a thing exists, we can look at how it relates to what we would generally see as a normal or normative human brain and a normative human behavior. And so as we go forward and we talk about the self, always thinking about it in relation to or in comparison to these individuals who do not have the capability to do so, to have a coherent sense of self, it's very important to maintain. Now the text begins also by introducing some important concepts that, while we've been introduced to, I believe, all of these, more or less, at this point, I want to be very clear about their meaning, which is why they're all on the side here in red. And we have talked about the self to some degree or another, sometimes from the perspective of George Herbert Mead and the idea of the self as the I and the me, right? The objective and the subjective self, and how they interact to produce this concept of the self that is socially situated rather than biologically developed. And so at this point, when we're talking about the self, we're really talking about this interaction, as it says here, this interaction between biology and social expectations brought into awareness through role-taking activities. Now, what does this mean? Well, what we're saying essentially here is that in this process, yes, biology matters. Yes, genetics matters. Yes, evolution matters. These are all important aspects to the development of the self. But we also have to think about the self, again, as this gestalt phenomenon, right? This thing that is unified, or at least we experience it phenomenologically as a unified structure. Unless, of course, you suffer from schizophrenia or other perhaps mental disorders. And so what we are talking about here is this interaction. And so as sociologists, we can't dispense with the importance of biology, the importance of neurology, the importance of evolution. But we can stress that we cannot put all our eggs in one basket, right? We cannot understand the whole total of a human individual with all of their hopes, beliefs, desires, actions, behaviors, just on the basis of biological characteristics. Unfortunately, there is just not enough variation in biological characteristics across humans to explain the wide variety of social variation. And so because of this, it is necessary to not only take into account these biological and evolutionary and neurological aspects, but how they come up against and how they engage with existing social functions and existing social facts. And so this is where we argue that the self comes from, right? So we have these biological, neurological, whatever you want to call them, characteristics, but they only make sense within the larger context of interaction, within the larger context of a Gestalt self. And so keeping that in mind, right, and we go back to Mead and we think about even the work of Charles Horton Cooley, who was Mead's predecessor. There is this important emphasis on role-taking activities. And if we remember from last week, when Mead was talking about the development of a child, one of the important parts was this ability to adopt the perspective or adopt a role in order to shape your own interpretation. And I would argue, in many respects, and out of my own research, that this is a form of empathy, right? And we tend to use the word empathy synonymously with sympathy, and I don't think that they can be used as such. Rather, empathy is that ability to cognitively and emotionally and somatically engage with different positions to try to understand them. And now, while they may be imperfect interpretations, as we will see further on in this, both this lecture and later on in the course, these role-taking activities through our empathic functions help us to try to understand and situate our own identity, our own self, within the larger field of social relations. And so this is what we mean by the self. This is what we mean about where it comes from, how it is this emergent phenomenon where there is no single characteristic that's more important than the other. But at the same time, we can't reduce the self to just its biological, just its neurological, just its social characteristics. We have to understand it in its total image. Then, of course, we have what is generally referred to as the self-concept. And this is a little bit different than the idea of the self. And part of this is because the research and literature on the self-concept emerged, I don't want to say separately from the work of George Herbert Mead, but rather in tandem with it, perhaps. And so we can think of major pieces like Victor Gaikas's The Self-Concept, which, luckily for you, I don't make you read. But it is, in effect, what we refer to in a very theoretical sense, because, again, it's very hard to separate out these components, as I argued earlier. But when we're talking about the self-concept, we're talking about the thing that we carry around as our self-image, right? There are a series of things that I believe to be true about myself. They may be accurate, they may be inaccurate. I have no idea, right? And sometimes we take very bruising blows to our self-esteem when our self-concept does not align with the reality of people's interpretations or understandings of us. And other times we have major boosts to our self-esteem when we find that our self-concepts, we may hold very negative self-concepts, but at the same time others may not view them as accurate. And so this aspect of inaccuracy is a very important one to always keep in mind when we're talking about these social psychological relations. Because one of the unfortunate aspects of the human, as it were, is that while we have the ability to try to understand other individuals, to try to adopt their roles, much of our interpretation is guided not by necessarily direct experience, but these larger ideological structures we carry around, these larger social structures we carry around. Again, if we think about social development and the example I used of Bronfenbrenner's levels of development and the ecology of human development. And so when we're talking about the self-concept, again, it's not going to be accurate. It is only going to be the thing that we use to measure ourselves against others. And that measurement may not be anything vindictive, but it's just the only way of understanding who we are, right? And so if we think about the examples last week of the wild boy of Avion, or Genie, the uncivilized child, although I don't like using those terms, they were both instances where they had not developed a self-concept because they developed in isolation. And so the self-concept can only exist in this sense of interactive processes, which is why a lot of symbolic interactionism informs this section of social psychology. And then of course we have this concept of identity. And we tend to use that word colloquially or in everyday conversation to mean any number of things. Usually referring to, we talk about things like identity theft, and so we use that to refer to an individual's set of life circumstances and the various material and social phenomena associated with it. Now that's not really what we mean by identity here, because when we're talking about identity, we're referring to, as I say, the basis on which individuals categorize and present themselves. And we can see this everywhere, right? This is one way. We can also think about social roles, right? When I think about my identity, right, there are a set of individual categories. Are there a set of categories on which I define myself? And these, of course, may be accurate, they may be inaccurate, but they're still used to shape my self-concept and further to shape myself, or my concept of the self, though not the self-concept. Probably need more vocabulary here, whatever. Now, so for example, right, when I think about roles, I have mentioned this before in an earlier lecture, right? I occupy a number of roles, and I'm very proud of the roles that I occupy as a professor, as a scholar, as a teacher, and as a husband, as a brother, as a son, as a uncle. And unfortunately, I don't live a very exciting... I suppose I'm a friend to some people. Not a whole bunch anymore, but it's besides the point. But, I live a fairly boring life, so I don't have a lot of identity categorizations. And I do want to talk about how identity works on multiple levels, not only in terms of the identities I apply to myself, but the identities that people apply to me. And so while I am aware of my identities as a white male, which is of course one of immense privilege in this country, it's also the case that when other individuals interact with me, if they are concerned about or thinking about aspects of race and gender, I will be seen as belonging to these categories to other individuals. And so this concept of identity is a two-way street, right? I have the identities that I self-categorize as, but then when I interact with other people, there are identities that I ascribe to them. And again, they may not be accurate, but they still occur, and they still influence my behavior. And so one way to think about this is going back to some of the talk about group processes and structures, about these concepts of in-group and out-group, and ways of having outsiders and insiders, and how identity characteristics serve to perpetuate and strengthen those in-group and out-group differences, regardless of whether or not they are physically identifiable, say through race, even though there's just to stress this fact again, that the position adopted by sociologists generally, and adopted by the American Sociological Association, is that race is a social construct. And I don't mean that in any provocative sense. Rather, what I mean is that while we do see differences in external biological characteristics, what we also know is genetically the variation between, say, whites and blacks, or blacks and Latinos, or whites and Latinos, the genetic variation is smaller between those groups than it is within those groups. And so what that means is that there is greater degree of genetic variation within what groups we classify as whites than there are, or groups that we classify as black, or groups that we classify as Latino or Asian or Pacific Islander, or, you know, the list goes on. But the genetic variation within those groups is greater than the genetic variation between those groups. And so when we say it's socially constructed, we're not saying that it's not important. We're not saying that it doesn't play an important role in our society. Rather, we try to point to the aspects of difference that we sometimes, by we I mean society, that society sometimes generally treats as legitimate biological differences, when in fact many of these differences are socially ascribed, as opposed to being actually biological, neurological, genetic differences. And so, you know, when we're talking about these three concepts, again, these are perhaps the most important concepts in sociological social psychology, because they give us the grounds to understand not only the individual, not only the self, but the larger web of social relations, the larger web of social groups, of social categories, of institutions, of social structures, of society, right? And so, again, as I was saying about identity, this is a two-way street. And so I can have identities that I ascribe to myself, but other individuals may have identities that they ascribe to me. Perhaps they are political identities, perhaps, again, they are racial identities, perhaps they are ethnic identities, perhaps they are gender identities. But the fact remains is that I may have ones that I identify as, but other individuals may not identify those same characteristics in me, or they may ascribe different characteristics to me. Excuse me. And of course, now I also want to mention the fact that in this larger corpus of, or this larger body of research, when we're talking about sociological social psychologists, we're saying that they are principally interested in the content of people's self-concepts. And so this is one way of trying to understand interactions and behavior, right? Because our self-concepts are, even though they are the object of our self-reflection, are essentially a combination of our perceptions, our emotions, and our behaviors, right? So how do we see the world? How do we interpret the world? How do we feel about it, right? Do we have an attitude with a high or low level of valence? Do we have a particular belief? Do we have a somatic response to certain, to exposure to certain social objects, material objects, whatever? And our behaviors. And it's important that we stress behaviors, because it may be the case that we all walk around with a set of positive or negative beliefs about other identity groups, but while that may have an impact on how we behave, how we think, one of the only ways that we can measure this, besides, say, surveys given to people, is through their actual behaviors, right? The actions that they undertake. And so we may know what they self-report as for certain attitudes or certain behaviors, certain attitudes, certain beliefs, certain values, certain identity characteristics. But if we cannot link that to behavioral outcomes, then the study of this does not yield much, right? It does not tell us a whole lot about the actual function of society. Because if identities and attitudes and values and beliefs do not translate to behavior, then what is the point of understanding them, right? If these are not linked, and all we have in the end for empirical analysis are the actual behaviors that people engage in. And so, keeping all this in mind as we move forward, and again, I'm sorry that was really long, but keeping all this in mind as we move forward is essential. And so I will try to cover the rest of the important parts of the chapter as quickly as I can. Now, you have to excuse me for a moment. And I'm out of water. and I'm not feeling coffee. Yes, those of you who are reading this, I do have a mug that says, "What would Weber do?" Weber, the important sociologist, one of the founders. I'm quite proud of it. And I'm also kind of a nerd. So, if you hadn't guessed that one yet. Now, the chapter begins by looking at some of these aspects of self-perception and affect, right? So the way we feel about things. And self-perception is, again, not all that different than what we mean by the self-concept. And so we're essentially saying, how do we perceive ourselves, right? When I look in the mirror, physically, there is an image that is presented back to me. But, on the other hand, we know that, I don't want to refer to them as disorders, but conditions like body dysmorphia can range from minimal to maximal, where a person looks in the mirror and does not see what other people tend to see, or maybe they see something only slightly different, right? And so what you see in the mirror is always going to be structured by your memory, your experiences, and your upbringing, and that may not be the same thing that other people see. And so this self-perception is an excellent and important starting point through which to understand larger social processes. And this approach was introduced by Charles Horton Cooley, which I mentioned earlier. Well, it wasn't necessarily introduced by him, but was popularized by him, which I mentioned earlier was a predecessor to George Herbert Mead. I may be saying this incorrectly, but I do believe that Mead was one of Cooley's students. Or at the very least, Mead wrote the introduction to some of Cooley's major works. And so, one of the points that Cooley was trying to make was that our social relationships are always going to influence our self-concept. And that's because we're always going through this process of self-reflection, right? We are always thinking about who we are, and that is always going to be changing, sometimes minutely, sometimes drastically, based upon how others treat us. And it may be the case that we think we're a highly intelligent individual, and someone tells us that, no, actually, you're pretty goddamn dumb. And so an individual is in many ways faced with a few options there. The first is they can say that, well, that person who called me dumb doesn't know what they're talking about, so that's fine. I will ignore that, and that will not influence my sense of self or my self-concept. Or you could take it and adopt your self-concept to reflect that particular position. Or you can even strengthen your own self-concept against those types of criticisms. And so the possibilities are myriad as to how this process works, but it is still an important process to consider. And Cooley referred to these as this process of reflected appraisals, or the looking glass self. And so they, in some ways this is a heuristic or a mental tool to simplify or more easily understand the points being made, right, when we're talking about the looking glass self. But what it essentially means, in the same way that we understood Mead, is that the person that we are, the person that we think we are, is always going to be shifting in minor ways. Sometimes it shifts in major ways, but for the most part we see minor changes based upon how others treat us, based upon how others claim to see us, based upon how others interact with us. And so, if we are someone who thinks of themselves as a kind human being, and we go out into the world and we are interacting with other people and find that everyone seems to be rude to us, or everyone seems scared of us, then maybe it's not the case that we're actually kind, but our self-concept was incorrectly interpreted. And so we may have to change our own self-concept to reflect these. So this is again what we mean by these concepts of the looking glass self or reflected appraisals. And so Cooley went on to argue that as we are building up ourselves, as we are going through the process of role-taking, of social development, of socialization, we imagine how we appear to another individual, right? And so what this essentially means is that when I'm walking around, when I'm thinking about how I'm presenting myself, and we can also kind of tie this into the work of Goffman and the dramaturgical approach, right? The idea that we have impression management. Now, excuse me for one moment, my camera is blinking at me and I'm not sure why. Not exactly sure what was wrong, but my camera did shut off, and good thing I noticed, otherwise I would just be sitting here talking into the ether, not even talking to a camera that I pretend is as a class, which is, well, depressing and terrifying. Now that I think about it, I'm going to double check and make sure the camera's recording. Well, I believe it to be, so here goes. Now, what Cooley was saying in this process of the looking glass self was that not only do we imagine how we appear to another individual, right? So we have the image that we see when we look into a mirror, and we imagine that that is how other people see us. And that may be true, that may not be true, but it doesn't change the fact that it is a major motivator to our social actions and to our concept of the self. The next is that we imagine how a person would judge us based upon our appearance. And sometimes this can be a specific individual. Maybe you are about to go on a date and you're worried that your date will not find your manner of dress or approach particularly attractive, and so you are worried about whether or not your date's going to go well. So you have these concerns that a person is judging you, and in many ways we do, right? People are judgmental, though perhaps not to quite the extreme that we worry, but the fact of the matter is that we make quick appraisals of other individuals when we meet them. And so we are aware that we do that, and so we know that other people are doing that to us. And of course, we also react to this perceived judgment with emotions such as pride or mortification. And so, again, if I was walking around thinking I was very well dressed and stylish, and a bunch of people come up to me and start making fun of me, these aren't real events. I mean, maybe when I was a kid, I don't know. I don't want to get into that. It's a very tender subject. And people come up to us and say, oh, well, what the hell are you wearing? Why are you dressed like that? You look like an idiot, right? We may be mortified. And I don't mean that in the literal sense, I mean that in the figurative sense. But we may be mortified that there is this disconnect between how we saw ourselves and how others see us. And so this is going to be an impetus to change. And we can see echoes of this in the concepts of cognitive dissonance introduced by Leon Festinger in, I believe it was 1957. And so what this means is that we have what we would call a feedback-based concept of the self, right? One that is always going to be changing in certain aspects of ourselves. They're going to solidify or crystallize, while others are always going to be up for interpretation and adjustment. And so part of this issue, of course, is, we adjust who we are, but there is this second aspect of whose opinions do we value? And, we'll go back to the dating example. Maybe you are trying to attract the interest of a particular individual that you just think the world of. And you develop this mental concept of what they like, how you want to look for them, so on and so forth. That means that individual, you are more concerned about that individual's opinion than you are of others. And those of you who are married, you will find that in the end, you tend to find your spouse's opinion to be one of the most important ones. or maybe you ignore them entirely. I don't know. Just assuming here. And assuming makes an ass out of you and me, blah, 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 blah. I'm aware. And so we tend to have, and this varies by circumstance, right? This varies by field, by context. But we tend to have a hierarchy of whose opinions matter to us most. And so, again, right, if you are working for an organization and you very much want to have a long-term job there and you want to have options for upward mobility within that company, right, you're not going to be so much interested in what the person who distributes the mail thinks about you than, say, someone who reviews you for raises or reviews you for promotions. Right? We have that hierarchical organization of who we think matters most. And again, that is going to vary from context to context, right? So when you're at home, right, not at work, you don't really care what that boss thinks about you while you're at home because it doesn't really matter, right? It has no influence or bearing on how you're going to behave. While you're at home, you may care about what your family thinks, or your roommate thinks, or your live-in partner thinks, or whatever. And so this is always going to be shifting, right? This hierarchy of concern for other people's opinions. And what Cooley argued, and later on Mead and to some degree another Festinger and Victor Gekas argued, is that your self-concept is going to shift in response to these types of reflective appraisals, particularly from those who you put at the top of these hierarchies of concern. And so if you value the opinion of someone to a very substantial degree, chances are if you find that their opinion of you is less than satisfactory, then you are going to want to change how you present yourself, who you are, to adapt to that, right? And so there's this constant, you may call it, I believe the academic term is discursive process of identity, right? There's never this, I am who I am and nothing changes that. For some reason I just had memories of Popeye the Sailor. I think he said something like that, but whatever, I'm getting off track. And then the text raises an interesting point, and that is if you get a pervasive feedback from a group of individuals, it can radically change your self-perception. And I write up here the example of cults. And so for your assignment for this week, independent of the discussion board and reflection journal, is to read this piece on a cult that emerged down in Texas. Now, it's not going to be the one in Waco. I believe that was the Branch Davidans and David Koresh, but rather a religious cult that emerged, which engaged in this process of persistent, pervasive, positive and negative feedback on member individuals to keep them within the confines of the cult. And so I'll have you read that. It's very fascinating, although I believe the reading is starting to get up there in age. The last time I had students read it was back in, well, I guess it was 2014, so it's not that old, although it may have been published in 2013. But it's an interesting example of how these processes work. And so, and I'll mention this again at the end of the lecture, but your assignment for this week, apart from discussion board and reflection journal, is to read this article and write a brief response to it that takes into consideration what is occurring in the chapter. And we can't really talk about the self-concept without really talking about this idea of self-esteem, right? And we generally have a notion of what we mean by self-esteem. We don't ever really have someone there consistently defining it for us, but what we're really referring to is the value that we ascribe to our individual self, right? And whether or not that value is deemed important, not important, whatever. And so one of the examples that I believe is included in the textbook is the Rosenberg scale of self-esteem, which is a useful and if you think back to our discussions of methodology, it is a valid and reliable survey tool to measure an individual's sense of self-esteem. And so if you're interested in it, and if it's not in the textbook, which I can't remember right now, and I'm feeling like an idiot for not being able to remember, but you can find it online just by doing a Google search for Rosenberg scale, and you'll find one where you can fill it out, and it'll give you the response. And so it may be an interesting way to see how your own interpretations of yourself are reflected within your sense of self-esteem. And what it does is it measures these aspects of reflected appraisals that we mentioned earlier about these social comparisons, which are, again, another form of reflected appraisal, but a little bit different, right? And so if we think about social comparisons, it's not responding to how people treat us and interpret us. Rather, it is how we see ourselves in relation to other individuals, right? Not so much the concern of what they think about us, but rather how we see ourselves in relation to others. And so these social comparisons are always going to be relative to some degree or another, right? So I believe one of the examples I talked about earlier on in the semester was looking at income and happiness. And it found that if you are generally of the same wealth category as your neighbors, your social comparisons are generally favorable, right? You don't think of yourself as rich or poor. But if you find that you are making less money than the majority of your neighbors, then through that relative social comparison, you see yourself as poor, right? You may see yourself as, or I don't know, you may see yourself as less attractive. You may see yourself as, whatever. But if you are hanging out with or living around a bunch of individuals that you make more money than they do, then the social comparison, again, that's going to be relative depending on the context of the situation, will be reflected in your self-esteem. And of course we have self-perceptions, which we can also think about in relation to these concepts of the self and the self-concept. I keep saying that. In the notion of the self and the self-concept. There we go. And certain aspects of, I guess you'd call it the, structural influences. Social structure and personality research has tried to see if there are any dominant characteristics that play a role in an individual's self-esteem. And so the text does talk about a few of these briefly, and some of them are very fascinating. And one thing we notice is that status characteristics, like race, class, gender, whatever, are very important in interpreting our self-esteem, but only in certain ways, right? And so one of the things that the text talks about is that if you find that a person is judging you not based upon your individual qualities, your individual characteristics, your individual behavior and actions, but rather on the basis of, say, the color of your skin, your gender, your occupation, your political affiliations, whatever, it becomes something that reduces your self-esteem. You have a less positive view of yourself. You find it to be more, I can't think of the proper term, but for lack of a better term, I'll use the word depressing. But you find it to be more depressing if someone measures you or bases their interpretation of you on strictly status characteristics as opposed to the individual ones we all carry around. Next, we also have the idea of social class. And what we found is that, overall, through a series of meta-analyses of studies, is that social class is not necessarily linked with self-esteem, but only when it is placed into juxtaposition. And so when we make social comparisons, right, a person's social class can heavily influence their self-esteem. But one of the other problems with social class is that the interpretation of it in our culture is so skewed, right, that trying to understand the role of social class and self-esteem is very difficult. right? And if you think about, say, social class as being determined by one's wealth or level of income, which is not a perfect measure of social class, what we find is that the majority of people, regardless of whether or not they're making $180,000, $200,000 a year or making $30,000 a year, tend to think of themselves as middle class. And we know that that is not an accurate assessment, but rather there is a social belief that most people are middle class, and so if you are middle class, you've made it. And most people like to think that they've made it. And so social class can be a difficult measure unless you are looking at those that are deeply impoverished, who are well aware of the fact that their social position within the hierarchy of class is at the bottom end. And this is principally because we are taught to internalize our social positions within status hierarchies as a reflection of solely our individual actions and our individual shortcomings. And so we don't think about the whole series of pressures of social structure, of existing economic relations, and the influence they have on limiting or directing our position in society. And that is not to say that we are not responsible for our actions. That's not the point I'm trying to make. But rather that individuals born into different social circumstances have a different range of options for what they can achieve. And sometimes they're able to surmount those limitations, sometimes they're not. But it doesn't change the fact that there are identifiable sets of limitations based upon one's emergent status characteristics. And so, keeping social class in mind, right, it becomes important to note that individuals at the low end of the spectrum tend to internalize their class position regardless of whether or not they lost their job because their company decided to move their jobs overseas and they were a upper level floor manager for a production company or for a company that was producing particular goods. And so they are not particularly well equipped to re-enter the labor force. And so they will internalize this. They will see it as a negative reflection on their self-esteem. Now age also plays an important role, but usually age in relation to other characteristics. And so age is not so much an indicator of one's self-esteem insofar as older people versus younger people, right? We don't see a lot of variation between the two. You know, we see some, but that we can account for that with other status characteristics. But when we look at something like gender, right, we see how the intersection between age and gender can influence a person's self-esteem and influence the way a person sees themselves and the way that they think other people see them. And so if we look at if you're not a preteen, teenager, or early 20-something, a millennial, I suppose. I believe I can never figure out what age range that's supposed to include. But if you look at gender differences in self-esteem, you don't see a whole lot in age brackets of 30 and above, or 10 or 11 and younger. But what we do see is that women tend to have lower self-esteem when they're in that age bracket between, I guess you'd say, 12 to 21, 22. And we can think about a number of reasons why this may be the case. One, of course, being that we still have a number of glass ceilings in our culture. And while it's been the case that we have an increasing number of females in top positions in various firms or government or whatnot, although not the presidency, clearly, what we do know is that this is still something that can influence whether or not a person believes that they can move farther ahead in society. And we also take into consideration issues of body image and body dysmorphia. And we know that while it is the case that both males and females suffer from body dysmorphia based upon media representations of what we constitute as attractive, it tends to be the case that women are far more likely to experience the brunt of that blow to their self-esteem. And so, while gender may not be a clear indicator and age may not be a clear indicator, when we combine the two, we see that females of a certain age range are far more likely to have lower self-esteem than males of the same age range. And so, in many ways, these structural influences can interact with one another, but there's not necessarily a single structural influence that has a direct impact on self-esteem. And then, of course, we have these aspects of whether or not a person believes in the judgment that they receive. I was sort of trying to get at this earlier. We were talking about self-concepts and self-reflections, that if someone says, "Oh, hey, Professor Gobeil, you're a really ugly man," and I could be like, "That's not true at all. I'm the most handsome man in the world, and doesn't matter what anyone says, you're not going to change that." And of course, I don't believe that. And I don't believe I've ever had a student call me ugly before, at least to my face, which is probably good. The fact of the matter is whether or not I believe in that judgment. And so one of the ways in which this occurs is through these processes of personal attributes versus status characteristics. So what I was mentioning earlier when we're talking about status characteristics is that when people are being measured based upon their status or identity characteristics, right, when they're being evaluated because of the color of their skin, because of their social class, because of their educational attainment, because of their gender, because of their religion, because of their political orientations, right, these are far more detrimental to a person's self-esteem than if the individual is being viewed based upon their personal attributes, right? So, well, yes, we all belong to a series of status characteristics that define in many ways who we are, but we also use to define ourselves. We also have personal attributes that transcend those status characteristics. And so when we are recognized for our personal attributes rather than status characteristics, we tend to have a stronger belief in that judgment that is made on us, and it tends to be one that we find improves our self-esteem rather than diminishes it, right, as we would see in instances where people are judging us based upon our status characteristics. Although this does raise an important question, right, what about social context? What if you are being praised for belonging to a particular status characteristic that has recently been identified as one that is, I don't know, immensely important in the structure or fabric of our society? I'm not really sure how I would come up with an example for this, but I'll just choose an example. Jewish rabbis. There we go. I was going to say I'll pick on them, but I'm not really going to pick on them. So what if it's the case that there was a large movement by Jewish rabbis to address issues of inequality in the country? And so while not all Jewish rabbis participated in this effort, many of them did, and they were successful and received all sorts of admiration for their actions. Now, if a person is a Jewish rabbi, I believe all rabbis are Jewish, but I'm not sure about that, so I will continue to say Jewish rabbis. And so what does this mean about someone who's a Jewish rabbi who was not able to participate, but still receives the benefits of the praise that the rest of the group received for their actions, right? Might this improve their self-esteem? Again, that's a question to consider. We don't have a good answer. And so I'm going to have to erase the board, and we'll come back, and I will talk about some of the more minute characteristics from the reading. And again, I will try to keep this relatively short. So I'm doing the best that I can. I realize I've already talked a lot. So give me one moment, and I'll talk to you guys soon. And we're back. Now, when we left off, we were looking at some of the issues of, I was going to say over here, but it's gone now. We were looking at issues of the self-concept, identity in the self, and how it emerges through these processes of interaction and through reflected appraisals. and how that contributes to aspects of the self, like self-esteem or self-worth. And so what we're going to look at further on in this chapter are some of the other dimensions of the self and the self-concept, other ways of looking at it, and aspects of identity and how it is associated with both the self and in larger social institutions. Now, I realize the lecture is already starting to get long, and I told you that I would do my best to keep that from happening. So I will work my way through this as quickly as possible. And obviously, if you have any questions that I can clarify, please do not hesitate to contact me. Now, one of the things we need to keep in mind when we're talking about the self is this idea of these cognitive structures or cognitive schemata. And what this is essentially referring to is that, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. So if you were to think about the way a car works, or the way an automobile works, most of us, given that we do not have a complex understanding of all the mechanical pieces that go into the systems of, I guess you'd say, the workings of the engine, the workings of the transmission, the workings of the braking systems, the workings of the different gear shifts. I realize that's part of transmission. The workings of the ways in which the engine cools itself or keeps itself warm in certain circumstances, how all these processes are aligned in ways that allow for generally easy travel. And so when we think about all that, when we think about a car, in many ways a car is itself a cognitive schema, or cognitive schemata, or whatever you want to refer to it as. And this is principally because when we think about a vehicle, we take a shorthand approach to understanding it by not thinking about all of those minute pieces that serve to make up the larger whole. And so, in many ways, our interpretations of the self operate in a similar way. And so we do walk around with cognitive structures that we apply to ourself, right? So we have our own self schematas that we use to have a image of ourself that is not boiled down to the various minute characteristics, but is rather a more, and I believe the word gestalt also works here, a gestalt interpretation of the larger organism of the self as a whole. And so, again, what that means is as you're walking around, you're not thinking about all the minute aspects of yourself and other selves or other individuals, but rather a larger scheme or schemata of that individual or of your internal self. And this creates certain problems according to psychologists. Now, to be clear, this is a very psychological view, right? This is one that is not particularly sociological, but rather refers to mechanisms or ways of thinking that have been identified by psychologists. And so what it is we're looking at here is that if you had a self-schemata or a schemata for someone else, or even identity schematas, although I realize it's not really addressed in the textbook, but it's still a valuable way to think about it, is that what happens is that these tend to become fairly rigid cognitive structures. And so when they tend to be very, very resistant to change. Because, again, if you think about the whole of an automobile, now, generally when you're driving around in an automobile, or if you're riding in an automobile, you're not thinking about the complex interweaving of the different mechanical parts and the ways that they work together to produce a push to move forward, or a reversing function, or a brakes system, or whatever you want to talk about. And so if one of those aspects of the vehicle is called into question, right, you still have the schemata of the larger vehicle and its functioning. And so because you know that vehicle works, you may reject information that is critical of one of those components, because you still know as a whole your cognitive structure of the car still functions. And again, we can use this analogy to understand the self schemata, because as we can think about in our own circumstances, whereas if we are presented with contrary information to us about ourselves that do not fit into the larger schemata, we may just reject it outright, because these things, as I say, are very resistant to change. And the reverse also works, right? When we have schematas for different identity characteristics or different identity groups or just different individuals, when we are presented with alternative information, we are highly resistant to it, right? We either that or we want to think about it as the exception, not the rule. And you can look at this example and think about how this also serves to reinforce stereotypes regarding different identity groups, how it serves to reinforce racist attitudes, how it serves to reinforce any number of these types of social divisions that are predicated upon both half-truths and untruths and prejudiced thinking. And so while it may be the case that you think that all, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example that won't offend anyone, and I can't think of a singular one, so I will, how best to approach this? Well, we'll go back to the example I may have mentioned earlier, introduced by Dr. Seuss, between the plain-bellied Sneetches and the star-bellied Sneetches. And so, in these two groups, one is seen as superior and the other inferior. And so, if it were to be the case that one of those from the inferior, supposedly cognitively inferior group, were to engage in an action that suggests that not all star-bellied or plain-bellied Sneetches are inferior, right? That would be seen as an exception to the rule rather than something that needs to be incorporated into the schemata, because again, these are resistant to change. And so we can think about how that process works in our everyday lives and how that can serve to reproduce these divisions between identities and these existing prejudiced beliefs about identity groups and the existent forms of bigotry that we see in regards to attitudes towards women, men, different races, different classes of individuals, whatever you want to talk about. But it doesn't change the fact that we still tend to walk around with these schemes in our minds because it is a much easier form of memory recall and cognitive structuring. And we can almost think of the same way in terms of our understanding of social order and habitual behavior, if we think back to the reading I had you guys do in regards to Garfinkel. And this is because if we were to be constantly aware at all times about every minute social interaction, its meaning, and its potential effects, right, we would be paralyzed with knowledge or information and indecision, right? Because there would be consequences, counter-consequences, whole systems of potential possibilities. And so by reducing it to a generally useful heuristic scheme, it makes functioning in the social world much easier. And so at the same time, for self-schemata and other schemata, they function the same way. They are useful for shorthand thinking, but at the same time they produce all sorts of problems. And now also in relation to the self and the self-concept and identity, we have or can take into consideration, as I mentioned earlier, the work of Goffman and the dramaturgical perspective. And we did talk about already, to some degree or another, impression management. But one of the things to keep in mind about impression management is that it is always this process where you are negotiating the aspects of the sort of reflected appraisals to achieve the interpretation from others that you like or that you want for whatever situation. And this can also take place through deceit, right? Either through direct lying to an individual about your credentials. And so I could say to you all that I have been teaching for 35 years. I have 3 PhDs, all from top Ivy League universities, just so I can give you an image of a respectable professor that you would want to listen to, because I know what I'm talking about. But of course, all those things are lies. I've only been teaching for it'll be 7 years coming up, and I only have one advanced degree, and I'm working on a second one. So, again, I'm not an expert in anything, and I don't attend Ivy League schools. But all of that could be presented in a form of deception to give you the impression that I am wanting you to have. And the same can be said for this process of feigning, which is not necessarily a direct lie, but has to do more with the presentation of self. And so we talked about the use of props or different, costumes or whatever, because again, we're thinking about this almost in a theatrical sense. And so the various props that someone may use to present themselves in a certain way. And so if I wanted to be perceived of in my identity or self as a medical doctor, right, there's a series of props that I can use, and I could walk around in the proper setting, and those people who didn't know me would more or less be likely to think that I was a medical doctor, despite the fact that I may not have said anything to support or disabuse those notions. And so these also take into consideration, or these are also ways of thinking about the processes of the self-concept, reflection of the self, or I suppose looking glass self, and these things like reflected appraisals. And so we can think again about Goffman's work in this context as well. But we can also keep in mind that there are individuals with, and I'm not exactly sure if these characteristics are tied to any particular other dominant characteristics or cultural characteristics, but we've developed ways to demonstrate whether or not a person is keenly aware of their public self-image or their private self-image, or what we would call our public self-consciousness or private self-consciousness. And so someone who is keenly aware of their public self-consciousness has a strong degree of public self-consciousness, there we go, would be far more likely to engage in forms of impression management to give the concept of the self that they want others to see. Whereas in private self-consciousness, right, this has to do more with how you understand and are cognizant of who you think you are and how that relates to the outside world. And so these are two ways of thinking about the self, and certain individuals are more likely to present a stronger form of public self-consciousness, while others are inclined to present a stronger form of private self-consciousness. And again, determining between the two and the causes behind each may be related to, say, occupational status, social class, right, any number of these social characteristics. But as I understand it up to this point, we don't have definitive answers for that. And I also mentioned here interaction rituals as schemata, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier when I was talking about self-schemata. But much in the same way that we talk about, like, the car as a scheme rather than a physical object, interaction rituals refer to the fact that on average, or on a day-to-day basis, when we interact with other individuals, there's a set of expectations about how that interaction will go. And Goffman refers to these as interaction rituals. Excuse me, man, coming down with a cold a little bit. And so these function in much the same way. And we can think about it also in terms of Garfinkel and the interactional vandalism or breaching experiments, principally because what happens in those is you're violating that interaction ritual, and it has an effect on people's behavior because they have these cognitive schemes of how they want to approach the world. And when that gets violated, it sets things all into a tailspin, right? Because your self-schemata, your cognitive schemes, are resistant to change, and so when they're presented with alternative information or presented with things outside of your field of expectations or a ritual, then it's going to skew the process. And we've already looked at that to some degree, and many of you have witnessed that firsthand now. Now, the other section of the chapter, and I don't want to talk about these other aspects of the self just yet, these are more concluding remarks, and so I want to talk about identity. Because I think that identity is one of the most important aspects of our current political climate. And the thing to keep in mind is that identities are false, I don't want to say falsely, but they are socially constructed groups. And so you have all sorts of identities, right? You have political identities, you have religious identities, racial identities, ethnic identities, gender identities, occupational identities, sub-identities within larger identity groups, musical identities, cultural identities. I mean, I could just go on and on. And there seems to be this case that there's this proliferation of different identity groups that have come to dominate how we understand the political process. And I'll get into that a little bit later when I'm talking about postmodernism and its effect on the self, but we'll put a pin in that for now. And the thing about identities as well is not only are they socially constructed, but they have differing effects on the way that individuals understand themselves and others. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we ascribe status characteristics or we ascribe behaviors to different identities. And so sometimes when we interact with individuals, we don't think about them in terms of their individual characteristics, but rather their status characteristics and the assumptions we make about the behaviors associated with those status characteristics. And again, we're essentially talking about the processes of prejudice. Maybe not necessarily racism, but prejudging an individual based upon certain characteristics. The thing about it is that, again, all of our identities are socially based. However, there are certain identities that we have seen that take on a greater degree of salience within an individual, depending on the context. And so this identity salience can vary between settings. And so for another example, again, I'm sorry I keep using myself, but I am sitting or talking to a camera in my room or in my office, and so I don't have students to pick on. And so I suppose I have to pick on myself. Now, when we're talking about identity salience, there may be certain identities that are more prominent in the individual. And so in most aspects of my life, I unfortunately take on the identity or role of a professor or a scholar. And that was not always the case, right? I have engaged in a number of occupations in my life. I was a pharmacy technician for a few years. I was a medical compounder, meaning that I made chemical compounds for patients. I worked in the medical field for a while. Or I worked in terms of, I was head of the long-term care wing, and so I was in charge of ensuring that all of the nursing homes that we worked with received their medications in order and on time. I even functioned in some capacity or other as a pharmacist. I also worked as someone who worked on policies and procedures for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. So if you ever go to a pharmacy and you have to sign off on HIPAA forms, one of my jobs was writing those forms and keeping track of all of our bureaucratic records. Very exciting. I actually didn't do that one for very long. It was really boring. But at no point in time did any of those jobs really have an effect on my identity salience, or my identity, or my self-concept, because they weren't salient characteristics of who I felt I was. And so at the time when I was doing this, I was a student, I was a musician, I was in touring bands, I was in multiple bands, and so those characteristics, right, took on salience in who I was. But now that the social and structural conditions of my life have changed, my salient identity is very much that of the academic. And so what we see is, and I'll talk about role reinforcement and social structure a little bit more in a moment, what we see is potentially issues of role-person merger. And what happens in this instance is that individuals tend to adopt roles and enact those roles or identities regardless of the fact as to whether the setting in which they are acting is appropriate for that role. And so we can think of I know I piss my wife off all the time by adopting what she calls my professor voice, in which I feel like it's necessary to explain the complexities of whatever nonsense thing we are talking about, whether or not it's with each other or with a group of people. And so here I have an issue of role-person merger where my role or identity as an academic begins to overtake many of the other salient characteristics that I used to have. And so that is just one example. And again, I don't always walk around like a professor, although unfortunately most of my life is spent doing this. And so it takes on, or it's easier to adopt this in terms of role-person mergers. And at the same time, we also see that because we have these pre-existing sets of roles and identities that people work into, they can also serve to reinforce or maintain existing forms of social structure. And so, I'll continue on with this example as a professor or a student, but if we have certain expectations as to how a student is supposed to behave, right, and a student is supposed to be fairly deferential to the teacher, although that gets annoying because then people don't question what I say, but students are supposed to be deferential to the teacher, supposed to do their work on time, supposed to be engaged, all these sorts of things that we consider to be aspects of a student characteristic or a student role. If we wanted to create a college setting where it was not the case that students were supposed to be deferential, but they were supposed to be critical and maybe not attacking, but open to interpretation of multiple perspectives and critical of their teacher, right, that would be something that would be very difficult to establish because of I don't want to say concrete form of these roles, but these relatively unchanging or stable aspects of these roles. And so what happens is when people enter these roles and then start to take on these behaviors, they reinforce the existing social structure in which those roles emerged. And so again, to extend this example, if a student came into my classroom and was deeply questioning of me at a very fundamental level, while I may not mind that, I can think of a number of teachers, whether or not it's at the college level or any level of education, where that would be a problem. And so that student would be punished to some degree or another, whether it's just through ignoring the student, which is another piss poor way to deal with it, but you get my point. But the student will be punished in such a way that their behavior will need to be corrected in order for them to adopt the role of the student, right? So it creates these very stable social structures by the very dint of the fact that we enter these roles and want to fulfill them. And then we also have what we would call I'm going to mispronounce this, but we'll say the Pygmalion effect, which is another way of thinking of the self-fulfilling prophecy that we discussed earlier. And what we essentially are referring to here, and we could also call it the Rosenberg effect, is another term for it. We were talking about the self-esteem measure. But what it refers to, again, as a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, is that it's referring to specifically a study where you had a group of students that were they were given a test to measure their IQ. And from what I understand in the study, while they may have taken that information and used it for later studies, they randomly told students within that class that took the IQ that those students had higher IQs than other students, regardless of whether or not they did. And what they found was that over time, those students that were told that they had higher IQs and were thus more intelligent on the basis of IQ as an imperfect measure, but they were told that they were more intelligent, they tended to perform better academically. And this creates all sorts of causal problems, right? When you think about the fact that in reality there was very little difference between these students. It's just some were told that they were smart and others were not told that. Right? Maybe they weren't, I'm not saying that they were told that they were stupid, but they were not given the secondary reinforcement of, oh, you have a high IQ, you should do well in school. And so again, this creates this self-fulfilling prophecy that is what we again refer to as what I assume is pronounced the Pygmalion effect. And again, that it may be wrong, you are welcome to correct me. And if you find out that I am wrong and you think you know how to pronounce it, please do tell me, because I have been mispronouncing that for a very long time. But then we also have the issue of how identity relates to things like these self-fulfilling prophecies, role-person mergers, and identity salience. And part of this takes place, on the one hand, in terms of self-categorization, right? Many of us, as I said before, self-categorize into different identity groups. But at the same time, other individuals place us into identity groups to treat us accordingly, based upon their cognitive structure of that identity group, not upon any specific individual characteristics that they may hold. And so this process of self-categorization and other categorization leads to additional problems with the Pygmalion effect. And again, this again is just this idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. And we talked about this in the group processes and structures readings. But that if you treat a person like they are inferior on the basis of whatever status characteristics, then they may internalize that, right? They may internalize that aspect of who they are because they belong to whatever identity group. And that in turn becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy, which is very problematic, because we know that the inverse of that, if you tell someone they're smart, they tend to perform better. And so if you tell someone that they're not as smart, what do you think will happen? And of course, this is what we're referring to here. And we also have issues of, say, I'll talk about identity and empathy in a moment, but we also have issues of, say, identity internalization, I said it right, and identity change. But much of this is related to what I refer to as the association between identity groups and empathic development. And again, I know this really isn't discussed in your text, but as I mentioned way back at the beginning of the semester, much of my social psychological research and sociological research and theorizing is on the phenomenon of human empathy and the role it plays in both reinforcing social institutions and social structures and in changing social institutions and social structures. And so, if we acknowledge that different identity groups create false constructs as to how people are going to behave, it limits what we mean by or what we can empathize with. Because if we acknowledge that empathy is this process of role-taking to some degree or another, and you assume that individuals based upon status characteristics belong to certain identity groups that you have these self-schemata or you have these schemata for, then you will automatically dismiss, perhaps not automatically, but it's easier to dismiss that group as belonging to a group outside of your understanding, making it much easier to ignore whatever plights they may be experiencing and much easier to not empathize with them. And this creates all sorts of problems when we get into issues of identity threats and identity change, right? Because one of the things we also need to acknowledge is that identities are important to people. And if the possibility for the survival of that identity is brought into threat, so identity threats, it may have a very detrimental impact on the behavior and their own sense of self or their self-concept. And so we can even look back at this recent election and how when we looked at the demographics of the voters, the people who helped to put President-elect Trump over the necessary 270 state delegates was a group of generally rural, white, trying to think of the rest of it. Well, whatever. They were generally rural and white, and so they shared certain identities. But we can look at their behavior, and in picking up on what President Cruz said, and trying to understand the conditions that drove the outcomes of this election. If you talk to these people, and living in Western Pennsylvania, I'm actually in the heart of this area, and so many of my neighbors are Trump supporters, and the majority of the population is white, lower to working class. Is many of these individuals felt that their identity group was under threat. And so because of that, they internalized various aspects of their identities and saw it as a way in which they could separate themselves from other groups, right? So they could limit their empathic proclivities and activities to specifically the identity group that they associated or affiliated with. Or at least that, I would argue that is one way to think about what happened. And so it may not be the case fully that we have a bunch of racists or bigots or sexists who are supporting a candidate, although one can make an argument that that might be the case. I'm not here to make that argument. You could say, or you could look at that situation and say, well, these individuals felt like their identity was under threat, and so the way to reinforce or strengthen their identity was to attack other groups. And again, I'm not saying that that was a correct action. Rather, I would argue that it is a potential outcome for our structuring of society around identity groups. And identity change is also a difficult thing to accomplish, because in many ways our identities are based upon these cognitive structures, right, as I mentioned earlier. And so changing one's identity, changing a fundamental concept of the self is a very difficult process, and one that tends to require extraordinary circumstances. And I don't want to talk about this too much, unfortunately, because I don't want to focus on that part of the chapter. I want to make sure that we're really exploring the larger aspects of identity and self. But one thing I want you to think about is the various identity groups that you associate yourself with. And then think about what it would take to get you to disassociate yourself from those groups. Right? Would it take physical alterations? Would it take occupational change? Would it take geographic, regional change? Would it take moving away from your family? And I bring this up because so much of identity is intertwined with our various social roles and social structures. Now, this also raises an important question that is addressed at the end of the chapter as to whether or not there is such a thing as a real or authentic self, right? And we can think about this both from the dramaturgical perspective and from the perspective of Cooley and the perspective of Mead. And to me, I don't have a good answer for this, and I'm not sure I ever will. Because when I try to think about whether or not there is an authentic self, I can't help but think back to the instances of Jeannie or the Wild Boy of Avignon. Because in many ways you could argue that they were authentically themselves on the basis of their impulses and desires, right? They acted upon their impulses and did so without hesitation, or at least without much hesitation, the way that we might, right? I'm assuming most of you do not defecate in the corner or masturbate publicly whenever the desire strikes. And if you do, I don't want to know about it. So keep that to yourself. But regardless, right, this may be a way of thinking about the authentic self or the real self. But if we think about Mead's interpretation of what we mean by the self, the me or the I, is this really a sense of self, or is this just an extension of our biological desires, our biological characteristics? Again, I don't think there's a good answer for that. At the same time, other people like to argue that the real self is situated in a person's social institutions or their roles. And again, this is also problematic because we know that in many ways social roles are always evolving and socially constructed. And so this leaves us at a very precarious point to try to make an argument that there is such a thing as an authentic self, right? Who you really are. And this may be a question worth addressing in the discussion board. In fact, I may bring it up myself, I'm not sure. But it is definitely one worth considering. And it highlights some of the issues and characteristics of the notions of self and the self-concept that we discussed earlier. Because what does it mean for a group of individuals in which there's no such thing as an authentic self? Or on the other hand, what does it mean for a group of individuals if there is an authentic self that is altered, or you can even argue corrupted, by social influences? Right? How do those processes work? How would we understand them? Again, no good answers. One thing that we've noticed recently in research on the concepts of self and identity is what Twenge would argue is an increase in narcissism among the millennial generation. So I'm talking to you guys, not all of you, but some of you, and a decline in empathy, which was identified by Sarah Conrath through a series of meta-analyses of college students, which you guys are. And it pointed out that following 2000, we saw a dramatic decline in empathy and a dramatic increase in narcissistic personality characteristics. But how do we explain this? I don't think we have a good explanation for it at this point. And so again, this may be something worth addressing in your discussion board questions or discussion board responses, and I encourage you to do so. But one way we can think about it, one potential explanation that is discussed in the book, although perhaps not directly, is the philosophical position of postmodernity or postmodernism. And those of you who are not familiar with it, I will not give you a overarching explanation because it will take a very long time. But independent of that, when we're talking about postmodernism, we're generally talking about this stage of social development that comes after the emergence of capitalism and modernity, in which there is a stable set of identities, roles, and characteristics that we fall into. And what postmodernist scholars argue is that our identities are much more fluid, or our concepts of the self are much more fluid than they used to be. And this is because of the increased degree of contact between identity groups, or increased degree of contact globally, and at the same time the rise of consumer culture, in which we can, to some degree or another, forge our identity or our self through the products that we purchase, which again I'm not sure is an accurate way to describe an identity, but it is a way in which people still attempt to do so, right? Through wearing different styles, through owning certain consumer commodities, through, I mean, you even get people getting into arguments over whether or not a Apple or an Android phone is better, or I'm trying to think, my brother is always insistent that the PlayStation 4 is worlds better than the Xbox 360, Xbox One. I believe that's the one that's out now. I don't have either. I don't have a whole lot of time for those things. Not that there's anything wrong with them. Academia, it takes a lot of time. And so we begin to classify and identify ourselves based upon these very fluid, consumer-based forms of culture. And so postmodernists would look at this and say, well, there's not the traditional set that we're used to. And so having this large expansion of fluid identities and fluid concepts of the self and fluid roles make it difficult to really understand the sort of modern notion of empathy and modern notions of narcissism. And so they would perhaps explain these changes that we see in our culture on the basis of these sort of self-directed identities, these self-directed development of the self that we see through consumer culture's shifting roles and changes in social positions. And so I will go ahead and finish off the lecture now, and I do want to let you guys know again that you will have an assignment for this week beyond the journal entry and discussion board participation that looks at an article about a cult in Texas and its role in identity formation, or the formation of the self. And so all that information will be available on Blackboard. And if you guys have any questions, let me know, and I hope to have everything graded within the next few days. So until next week, you guys take care.